everyone, and welcome back to another episode of my author interview series. Today I am super excited to be bringing to you guys a self-published Saturday video. Today I am going to be interviewing Grace Ericson, who is the self-published author of Christian contemporary romance books. I had such a great time coming up with interview questions, and I really hope that you guys will enjoy getting to know her and learning more about her writing process in this video. So, take it away, Tara.
Hi there, my name is Grace Ericson, and I write contemporary Christian romance novels set in small towns, on farms, on ranches, pretty much things like that. And my first series started in 2018, finished in 2019. It's a 4-book series called Main Street Minden, and it takes place in Indiana and walks you through the seasons in this small town with 4 different love stories. It's a lot of fun, very fun characters and, quirky small town charm. But also, I really strive to give my characters a spiritual journey as well. I say that I write stories of faith, hope, and happily ever after. So along with, meeting someone and falling in love, or discovering a deeper relationship with someone who was their best friend, something like that, my characters are going through a spiritual journey and growing in that regard as well.
So what made you choose to be an independently published author, and specifically to write Christian fiction?
I never pursued traditional publishing at all. I chose to go independently. I really felt like when the time came and God was telling me, you've got this book, you need to finish it, and then you need to get it out into the world. And it was really challenging for me to do that and to trust that I could do it on my own. But I've really come to love kind of this entrepreneurial side of being a independent author, because we kind of have to do it all, right? We have to plan our own schedule. We have to plan out our series and do all of the marketing and all of the launching. And then we have to work with our editors and our cover designers. But we have so much control over what the cover looks like and what the storyline looks like, and all of those things that can tend to get taken in by the publishing company in traditional publishing. So independent publishing really appealed to me when I started looking at the publishing process, mostly because I'm a little bit of a control freak, and I wanted to know that I was going to be happy with the final product. And so that's what I did. I discovered Christian fiction later in life. I was raised in a Christian home, grew up going to church and Bible camp and all of those things, and had a pretty strong faith throughout. But as an avid reader, Christian fiction wasn't something that I even really knew existed. And so I found myself reading whatever I could get my hands on. So I read a lot of fantasy novels, and I read a lot of what my parents had around the house, which at our house was like Tom Clancy novels or Danielle Steele, Nora Roberts type of romance novels. And I love romance novels. I always have. But for a 12, 13-year-old girl, some of the romance novels that I found at our house were not probably the most edifying thing that a young, impressionable woman should be reading. And so I got myself into a little bit of trouble there, and really was convicted to just stop. I had to stop reading romance novels until in college, when I discovered that Christian fiction was even a thing. And just my first Christian fiction novel I ever read was Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers, which, if you have never read it, go and do it right now. Pause the video and buy the book. But it really just changed my life. Not only did it improve my faith and deepen that, but it also opened up this whole world of, there are authors out there who write books with a Christian worldview, and that just changed everything for me. And when I started writing my first book, it came out as Christian fiction. There was too much too much emphasis on my faith and on the spiritual journey of my characters for it to be anything but. And I think that just comes from a place of when your faith is really critical and key to who you are and how you view life, then that's how your characters are as well. And so I fell in love with reading Christian fiction and reading the characters that people created and watching them navigate the world and navigate their problems and their relationships through the lens of their faith. And that's what I wanted to write as well. And so that's what my characters do. You know, they are faced with real problems. And, you know, in my last book that came out in October of 2019, sorry, you know, I have a character who's a male teacher, and he teaches middle school, and he's falsely accused of doing things he shouldn't do with students. And he really has to wrestle with what that means and what is God doing in his life and why God would let this happen. And, you know, you get to see kind of this journey that he goes through along the way, along with falling in love with a beautiful, quirky woman who shares the same interests he does in comic books and some of those other things. So it's a lot of fun, but we deal with real issues because life is not a Hallmark movie, unfortunately, as much as I love them. So that's why I publish independently, and that's why I write Christian fiction.
What is one thing about self-publishing that you wish you would have known before you started?
Oh, what do I wish I would have known about self-publishing before I started? So when I first wrote my book, it was really just for me. I had never intended for it to see the light of day. I shot it to a friend, you know, when it was 10,000 words in. I just started writing it for fun, mostly because I traveled a lot for work and found myself on airplanes and in airports and stuff where I had no internet, didn't have anything really to work on for work, and didn't really want to work on work. And so I opened up a Word document on a flight one time and I started writing. And that whole process is probably 4 years. You know, I forgot about it. I opened it 3 years later when I really felt like God was saying, hey, remember that book you wrote? Actually, I thought I had lost the whole document. I couldn't find it and my Dropbox had expired, but I did find a draft of it. And so what do I wish I would have known about self-publishing? I wish I would have known what an adventure it is. I am continually learning new things, which I love. And it's not just the writing, which although that has been a lot of it, like just the amount there was to learn about story and writing and structure and all of those things, because I have no creative writing background other than reading a whole lot of books. But also the things I've had to learn about marketing and email services and advertising and all of those things that go along with it. I think I underestimated all of the moving pieces that go into putting a book out and being a published author. So I wish I would have known that ahead of time. I think what I would have done is waited on my first book, because I was so excited, right? You finish the book, I've got the cover, it's beautiful, I'm so excited. And I very strongly felt God telling me that this book needed to go into the world. And so my reaction eventually, after a lot of knockdown, drag out discussions with my creator, was that, all right, if we're going to do this, then let's do it now. And I hit publish. And in looking back, you know, almost a year and a half later, the book wasn't ready. The cover wasn't good. My business wasn't developed. I didn't have the things in place that I should have had, like an email list and all of those. So all of those issues are fixed now, and I've gone back and made edits to the book, and I've changed the cover already, and now I really feel like it's the book it should have been. But if I had taken my time to learn what I needed to learn and then hit publish, I would have been in a much happier place. So that's what I would probably do differently.
So I realize the process probably varies for each and every book, but how long does it take you from start to finish to write, edit, and publish a book?
That answer is changing every day. So my very first book, obviously I started it, no intention of publishing it. It, from start to finish, was a 6 or 7 year project. My subsequent books have gotten faster, but I also, I hit publish on a novella the morning before I gave birth to my second son. And so the books after that have taken a lot longer also, because now I have 2 little ones at home, and during the pregnancy I was super sick and just didn't get a lot done. But now, as I get my routine figured out and as I become a more efficient writer and have to do less editing, especially on the storyline and all of that, it probably takes about a month to draft a novel, and then about a month to edit it and get it ready for publication. And this year, actually, in 2020, I'm releasing 4 books in 4 months. And so I cannot write a book a month, but I will be working ahead of myself. Hopefully, I'm not great with deadlines. Working ahead of myself and getting out the first 4 books in a 6-book series should come out in May, June, July, and August of 2020. And I'm super excited about that. The prequel will actually come out in March, so that'll be book 0. So actually it'll be 5 books in 7 months. So it's crazy, but it's fun, and my process is being streamlined, and I'm not doing it all myself as much as I did when I very first started. I actually have a wonderful editor now who has gone through and edited all of my existing books and is working with me on my next ones, and love her. She's a genius, and she makes me a much better writer. So that helps immensely, because the proofreading and the editing phase takes probably the longest for me. And then I'm also working with this series. I hired out a cover designer instead of doing it myself. So some of those things make it go faster as well.
How much of the work do you outsource, if any? Editing, formatting, cover design, etc. If you do some or all of it yourself, what was that process like?
So I do outsource my editing. I have a couple of beta readers and my editor. My mom proofreads for me. She used to be my main editor, but she's a really excellent proofreader. So she proofreads for me, which is great, and she's my biggest cheerleader. And I do have a cover designer that I am working with for my next series. It's Angela Stevens at the Cat's Pajamas cover design, and the covers are beautiful. I have not revealed them yet, except for in my exclusive reader group has seen the prequel cover. So jump in there if you want to check out my covers. About a month before anybody else gets to see them, I reveal them in my Facebook group. But my first series, I actually did the covers myself, and I do not have a background in cover design or graphics or anything of the sort, but it is something I've always liked to play with. I did a lot of marketing and social media for the company I worked for, and so I was fairly comfortable with graphics manipulation. Let me see if I grab. So on my second cover, this is what I ended up with. This is Falling on Main Street. That's the first book in the Main Street Mended series, and did that cover myself, and it's actually something I really found I enjoyed. And so the covers that I would kind of create as concepts for books, or if I just found a really fun picture, then I started making a theoretical cover for it and have started kind of selling those on the side. But it's not something I put a lot of focus in, and that's because I'm not a cover designer, I'm an author, and so I don't want to distract myself too much. So I do it because I enjoy it. Sometimes, like just watching TV at night or something like that, I'll pull out my laptop and browse the stock photo sites and see if anything stands out to me.
So would you recommend doing it that way, or have you learned something else about the indie publishing industry through your experience that you might change the next time you go around?
I am a firm believer in stretching my own abilities. So I think for my first book, to have done it entirely by myself, I had one person, I had my mom do a quick edit, but nothing substantial. It was good. Like, for me to do my very best at the time to put out a product was probably the biggest learning experience I could have had, right? It was getting a book, writing a book, editing your book, creating a cover, and putting it up for publication. Like, going through the process one time without spending money and getting, doing all this stuff is like getting a master's degree in self-publishing, because you learn things that you couldn't learn any other way, I feel like. And so now I know the pitfalls that my editor might have, or my cover designer might have, or any of those things. Like, I know what the process looks like from start to finish. And so would I do it myself again? I mean, I do. When I put out novellas or short stories or things like that, I typically don't do a lot of the outsourcing then, just because the time and the cost and all of those things don't necessarily make sense for those smaller projects. The one thing I would say that's helped me a ton is hiring an editor who had a writing background that I didn't have. And so it's really knowing and evaluating your own strengths and doing what you can to improve yourself, but also be aware of what is just outside of your skill set, perhaps. And is it worth your time to improve your skills in those areas, or would you be better off hiring somebody? And I think the answer is a lot of times both, right? I have improved my own editing skills, but I'm also hiring an editor who has a much more advanced skill than I do.
So you mentioned that you also kind of dabble in cover design and graphic design. So what are some tips and tricks of that trade, and what is that process kind of like for you?
Yes, I dabble in cover design. I would not call myself a cover designer. I really only did it because I didn't have the money to spend on a cover when I first started, let alone I knew I wanted a 4-book series, and I didn't have the money to put out for 4 books. And so I enjoy it, like I mentioned. Tips and tricks for cover design, I would say I have an Instagram story that kind of walks through one of my cover designs. It's for a nonfiction book, but the premise stands. At the end of that story, I listed a few rules that I would consider for cover design, and a lot of this I've taken hanging out in the cover design like Facebook groups and just lurking. I lurk in a lot of Facebook groups because I just want to take in as much information as I can to help me. And so in those Facebook groups, I learned a lot about typography and font selection and things, and making sure that your font matched your genre. And the other thing you see in a lot of those, there's some cover critique groups out there that are specifically made so that somebody can put up their DIY book cover and people will give feedback on it about your font or your image or the Photoshop manipulation that you did. Any of that, all of it is kind of up for grabs, and the groups are wonderful. You can message me if you need to know exactly which ones they are, but the biggest thing that I saw kind of people making mistakes, like they were common mistakes, was to think that your book cover had to tell exactly what your story was about. And I don't mean like, your cover should be representative of your genre. If you're writing a romance, you either put a couple, kissing on the cover or embracing or something, it needs to look like romance. Especially important for independent authors. Traditional covers can be a little bit more flexible because they grab the reader in a different way than the independent author does. And especially because you're on a thumbnail that's, this big, your cover needs to very clearly tell you what genre it is. So that was a big mistake. So somebody would be like, well, my story takes place in Africa and there's these hippos and whatever. And so they had a hippo on the cover and an African tree, and it didn't tell you what genre it was. Is it mystery? Is it romance? What is it? We can tell it's in Africa and there's a hippo. But being more on point for genre was way more important than being actually representative of the story. So that was a big thing. The other thing that I did for my Main Street Minden series was I made the covers before I wrote the stories. And I did that again for my next series, which is called the Bloom Sisters series, because for me, it's a way I can get inspiration from the covers themselves. And find, if you already have the story written and you know who the characters are going to be and what they look like and what their quirks are and all of those things, then you get kind of caught in this mindset of, oh, I need this guy on the cover and he's got to be 6'1" and he needs to have a beard and he needs to wear a lumberjack shirt or whatever your character looks like. But if you do it the other way around and you say, oh, here's my cover, and this is the couple that happened to be in the picture for my cover, and she's blonde, he's a redhead, she's almost as tall as him, he's, not that muscular, but is kind of athletic. Those are the types of things where you can be like, oh, okay, well, maybe he's, a businessman, but he really is into fitness or something like that, where you can make your story fit your cover more than make your cover fit your story. And that works for me. It doesn't work for everybody. But that's kind of what I found. I did go into my series saying, okay, well, I know that I want this couple to be a mixed race couple. And so when I was looking for pictures, that was like kind of what I searched for. And then I found the picture and I said, okay, now I know, okay, she is, she's mixed raced and he's white, and okay, how does this all play out? And it became an integral part of the story itself. So that's kind of my process. It doesn't work for everybody, but I do know that it really bothers readers and authors. Don't worry, it bothers authors too. If the character in the book doesn't match the character on the cover. And even in traditional publishing, like they'll put a redheaded girl on the cover and you read the book and you're like, wait a second, she's blonde. And realize that the author had probably very little say in that, especially for a traditional published book. But I think for the most part, the independent authors that I know try really hard to make it cohesive, the title and the cover and the story itself. So your image selection for cover design and your font selection. And along with font selection, I would say that you should probably only have 2 fonts per cover and maybe 3 to make it feel cohesive. But a lot of times people will have, 2 different fonts within the title itself, maybe like one bold word and then some other in a different font, and then they'll choose a different font for the author name and a different font for the tagline or the series title, and it just kind of ends up looking like this mishmash. So if you can keep it to 2 different fonts on your cover, or maybe 3 at the very most, then you end up with a very nice cohesive look. The other mistake that came up a lot in those groups was people not making the title and the author big enough. And I think especially that the author name, and I'm probably guilty of this as well, but if you look at most traditionally published books, especially in certain genres, the author name will be as big, if not bigger, than the title itself. And I think there's a confidence thing there for independent authors where we're like, oh, but I'm not that important, I'm just the author, and so they make their name really, really small at the bottom, and they get lost on the title. And so part of that is recognizing that as an author, especially if you're going to write multiple books, your book is not your brand. You are the brand. So Tara Grace Ericson is the brand, and that's what I want people to remember. I want them to remember me, not necessarily the title of my book. Although if you remember both, that's great. But I know that if you can remember me and you type that into Google, you'll find the books. Typing in the book title won't always get you where you want to go.
So obviously that's just something that you kind of do on the side when you have the time or when you can, but what tips would you give for managing author side hustles?
Oh man, side hustles. So it's so tempting, especially as you dive into being an author, to get wrapped up in this idea that, well, I'm paying somebody to do this and I can do it myself, and maybe other people would want to pay me to do it for them. And that's great, and it's a great way to pay the bills, maybe while you wait for a new release or your book sales aren't what you want them to be. But it's also kind of a dangerous thing because all of those things that you do pull you away from writing. So if I design a set of book covers for somebody and I'm in the middle of drafting a novel and they need their book covers, my responsibility shifts to them and it goes away from my own project. So I'm not saying that there's anything against author side hustles. I've been approached about editing for people. I've been, I do the cover designs occasionally, but for the most part, it's really easy to let your side hustle take over your author business. And instead of being an author business, it becomes a personal assistant business or a cover design business or an editing business. And I think with every decision, you kind of have to make the call about what are my priorities. And okay, if I need to edit somebody's manuscript to make sure I can pay my bills this month, then by all means edit somebody's manuscript. But if you've got the choice and being an author is your priority, then put the priority on being an author and let the other stuff fall away. And if you find that you're continually needing to do this or you enjoy doing it maybe more than you like writing the books, then by all means, there are people who maybe started as an author, but now they're a cover designer and that's how they make their living. And you get to still work with a bunch of authors, and you get to be in this world, and you get to, do the insider thing, but you're doing what you love and you're making money doing it. And that's important too.
What is your favorite aspect of being self-published, and what would you say is the hardest or most difficult aspect of being self-published?
My favorite aspect of being self-published is really I would say my favorite aspect of being self-published is the flexibility that it gives our family. I came from a 50-plus hour a week corporate job, lots of travel, really, really stressful. And switching to being an author has been amazing for our family. I have 2 little ones. I have a 3.5-year-old and an almost 1-year-old. Probably he'll be 1 by the time this video airs. And so the ability for us to, take a day off because the kids are sick, or just take a day off and have fun, has been wonderful. We never would have been able to do that like we have been now. On the business side of it, my favorite thing is actually how close I get to be with my readers. I get to send out my newsletter. I interact with you guys on social media. I get those emails back that tell me, oh, I loved your book. It improved my prayer life. Or one of the things that I do is I pray for every one of my readers. I pray for every one of my books. But I also put in my newsletters most of the time a request that if anybody who gets my newsletter and reads it and needs prayer or has a need, that I get, please let me know, and I would love to pray for you specifically. And so the emails I get back with people who are dealing with something really hard in their life or challenging, then they ask for prayer, and I get to cover them in prayer, and I get to open the emails, a week later saying, thank you for my prayers. The test results were negative, or whatever it is. And that's really cool. And that's one of the ways that I've really seen God work in my author business, is that, I get to talk with you guys, and I get to encourage you, and you encourage me. I mean, I'm human too. And even though I'll write Bible verses in a newsletter about something uplifting to help you, I struggle with things too. And so that's one of the best parts about being an author and being a self-published author, is that I get to hang out with you guys. So that's really fun. The hardest part about being a self-published author, I will be honest that I took a huge pay cut. Our family took a huge pay cut so that I could be an author. Because I did used to be an engineer. And this isn't the next question, but I was an engineer before I became an author. I have a degree in metallurgical engineering, which is material science, chemistry, all of that kind of thing. And I worked in the steel industry, which I loved, and I loved my job. Even when I left, I loved my job, and I loved the people I worked with. But there were some things happening, and very clearly I saw God closing these doors that were like this. It was things I had been working for years, and moves that I thought that was exactly where I was going to go, and God kept closing these doors, and we were like, well, what do we do now? And so we prayed a lot about it, and my husband ended up interviewing for a job out here in Missouri. We lived in Indiana before, which is why the Main Street Minden series actually is in a fictional Indiana town. But we lived in Indiana, and we moved to Missouri so my husband could take a new job. And God was really telling me, don't get a job when you move. Don't get a job. And I'm going, what do you mean don't get a job? I'm an engineer. I have this degree. I want to use it. And I make a significant portion of our household income. And God's like, don't get a job. I'm like, okay, well, I won't get a job, but I'll start my own company. And so I started a consulting company and tried to do that for a little while. And it's so funny. God has such a sense of humor. Literally, not one person wanted to hire me as a consultant, even though if you would have asked people in the industry, I was one of the few people who knew what the heck was going on with this product. And no clients, none whatsoever. And God was like, well, since you're not busy, why don't you finish that book? And so I did, and then I started writing the next one, and I started publishing. So God has really he's really made this happen for me and really pushed me, and is continually calling me to be bold in my writing. And for me, that has been, okay, I did all of the first stuff myself, right? But now it's been, okay, I want you to spend money on this, and I want you to hire an editor, and I want you to pay for Amazon ads, or pay for a class, or whatever it is, taking those steps in faith and really be bold and trust that God has got this. And so that's what I've been trying to do. The hardest part of self-publishing for me is really managing my time. So I have time to write. That's the hard thing. I have time to write. My children are in childcare during the day so that I can write, because this is my job. And I still struggle to use my time wisely, I guess would be the best way to put it. And it's hard because there's nobody holding you accountable except for you. You don't have a deadline from a publisher. You don't have anything like that external to keep you on track. It's all the deadlines I set, the goals I set, which is good because, kid is sick and I can take the day off, and, my timeline moves by whatever it is. But it's also really easy to get distracted by Netflix or a good book or social media or designing covers that I will never write the books for. So that's the hardest thing for me right now. That's what I'm struggling with. My word for the year of 2020 is intention, because that's what I'm going to be trying to do, is using my time with intention and using my interactions intentionally and all of that. So that's my struggle. Pray for me, please, because I have a lot of books to get out this year. And if I continue, watching Netflix at 2 p.m. instead of writing, we're going to be in deep trouble. So that's the hardest thing.
So you used to be an engineer before you became a creative writer. What was that transition like for you?
Yeah, so the transition from being an engineer to being a writer has been intense. It's definitely two different sides of the brain, for sure. And I would never claim to be your typical engineer. My husband, on the other hand, very typical type A engineer, like, everything is in line. I am not that way. I've always been more creative, more strategic, more less detail oriented. I'm very big picture. And so I loved the part of engineering and in my job where I got handed a big tangle of a problem and just got to unravel it and make it all make sense, or figure out why it was the way it was. And my previous company gave me a lot of freedom to do that. Working in manufacturing, my entire job was basically, my job description was go make things better. And so I had almost complete freedom to jump into places in the operation, find problems, and fix them, which was super fun. Now, as an author, I have this whole author business, and it's not unlike being handed this big tangle of problems and beginning to unravel them. So there's a ton to learn. There was so much to learn. I took one English class in college, and I'm pretty sure I knew more than the instructor. So, legitimately, I pointed things out to him in the MLA handbook that were wrong, or that he had said wrong. But that was the extent of my English class, because they didn't care about your ability to write a story or even write a paper. For the most part, it was numbers and charts and graphs. And so switching to the creative mindset was difficult. But I also because I had so much freedom in my previous job to find a problem and fix it, I get to apply that to my writing career also. Okay, if I know there's something wrong in this book, right, or this character, like there's something that's not cohesive, or the story is dragging, or whatever it is, my engineer analytical side of my brain can zoom in on it and say, okay, I know that this is what it should look like, and here's how to change it to make it fit. So it is a big shift. It's really funny to tell people that, oh yeah, I went to this school and I have a degree in engineering, and they're like, oh, what do you do? I'm like, I write romance novels. And they always get this really confused look on their face. But it's been a wonderful shift for me. I don't think I could go back. As much as I loved it, I don't think I could go back to, and maybe it's not even the engineering as much as it is like the structure of working for someone else versus working for myself. But yeah, I'll always have that engineering degree, I guess, to fall back on. But I wouldn't have been able to step into the creative writing and the author business without God's very clear, like, message to me of, okay, no, this is where you need to go. This is what you need to do. And it's been an adventure, and he's been alongside me every step of the way, for sure.
What advice would you possibly give to people looking to change their career path or make writing a part of their career?
I would like to say, don't do what I did. Don't quit your job and cut your household income in half before you even have a book finished. Don't do that. But what I would say is make time to write in your existing schedule, and whether that's on airplanes or in the morning before the kids get up, or at night after they go to bed, or on your lunch break, whatever it is, make time to write and finish your book, and then start another one and keep writing. And then go back and edit your first book. And then the other thing I would say is join some of the Facebook groups for writers, and not just like writing craft Facebook groups, but the business groups. So there's tons of them out there about marketing and being an indie author and all of those things, and how to make this a career, a full-time career. And that's kind of one of the interesting things, is that as traditional publishing has changed over the years, it's incredibly difficult to be an author that can earn a full-time living if you're traditionally published. And part of that is just because of the pace that, a traditionally published author can maybe write, maybe a publishing house will do 2 books a year with you. Maybe you go through another publishing house with a pen name and do 2 more books a year or something like that. But with what they are able to pay you in advances now, and what your royalty rates are through a traditional publisher, I would say, I'm trying to remember what the statistic was, but it's something like 95% of authors will earn less than $10,000 a year. So like even the big names that you recognize and know, like, they are probably not earning a living on their writing, which sucks, because their books are wonderful, right? On the other side of the coin would be your independent authors, who you may not have heard of. They might not be a household name. You might not see them in the bookstore when you go and browse, but they are putting out 4 books a year, or 5 books a year, or 6 books a year, and they're earning a full-time living. And I know more than a handful. I mean, I can name 20 off the top of my head of like independently published authors who are earning a full-time income. and replacing the income that they had from a job previously. And so depending on what your need is and what your financial situation is, I would say will kind of dictate what your path forward is. Can you afford to quit your job and write full time? Maybe. I wouldn't recommend it. Or can you publish a book a year on the side until you have enough of a following to write full time? Yeah, I see people do it all the time. Do you still want to be traditionally published? Then by all means, start querying agents, polish up that manuscript and get it ready to go. But it's an entirely different world than it used to be. And people sometimes think that there's still this old mentality of equating self-published authors with, Aunt Jenny who wanted to write a memoir and had to order 1,000 copies of her books, and so now she has to peddle them in stores and on the street or whatever. Independent publishing isn't like that anymore. I don't have to order any copies of my books, and you can still get them as paperbacks. And that, I think, is one of the major shifts. And of course, there's the Kindle and the ebooks and all of that, which is 90% of the books sold these days or something crazy are digital. But there's nothing better than like getting your first book written and published and then holding a copy of it in your hands. But I don't have 1,000 copies of my books. You can see a few of mine. These are my books. But what happens is if somebody wants a paperback copy of my book as an independent author, then they go to barnesandnoble.com or they go to Amazon and they press buy on one copy, and then Amazon or another company who like ships to Barnes and Noble and Walmart and all them, they print one copy and then they ship it to the person. And so it's like all of these big, huge hurdles of quantity for traditional publishing and presses has gone away because it's called print on demand. And if you order 10 copies, they print 10 copies. If you order one copy, they print one copy. And that has really changed things. And so I can still get paperbacks and I can still distribute them to like local bookstores or, the Christian bookstore in my hometown is still independently owned, and so they'll carry my books. But it's not like it used to be, I guess. If anybody's asking you to pay a bunch of money to publish with them, there are a lot of publishing houses out there called, we call them vanity presses, because it's really if kind of the old school self-published author type of thing where you just wanted to publish a book and you were willing to do whatever it took, including shell out a whole bunch of cash. So if anybody's asking for money for you to publish with them, if you submit to a publishing house and they come back and say, we'd love to publish you, but it'll be $5,000, run away as fast as you can, because they are essentially going to self-publish your book for you and take a bunch of money for the privilege. And they make their money off of you paying them, not off of selling your book. And so it's very predatory, and I still see a lot of really, I would say, non-tech savvy people kind of fall for that because they don't realize how much it's changed. So you can publish a book on your own, and you do not need to pay somebody that much money to do it. And that doesn't mean it's not going to cost you money, because in all likelihood, you're going to need to hire an editor, you're going to need to hire a cover designer, and you're going to need to pay for a website and on all of those things. But you can do it a lot cheaper than $5,000. And if you do it yourself, even if you spent $5,000, which would be an outrageous budget in my mind, you would make more on the royalties, and you don't have to give a cut to this company who managed the details for you. So run away from vanity publishing, but also don't quit your job and write full time before you've ever finished a book. It's not a great strategic plan, and that was one of the reasons that I argued quite extensively with God about it to begin with. because him telling me not to get a job when we moved was like so backwards to my logical engineer mind. That does not make sense. But he's, of course, he's made our path smooth and has blessed us in order that I can write.
Where did the inspiration come from for the Main Street Minden series?
The inspiration for Main Street Minden, and actually this book, this is the first book I wrote, the one I wrote mostly in airports. So we lived near Indianapolis, Indiana, and on my way to work, because I worked kind of out in the country, I would drive through all these little small towns every day. So I had about a 45-minute commute in the country through these small towns. And so some of them were really cute and pretty. And I started to drive past them and started to think, what are the stories of the people who live here? And, I would drive by this little cafe and I'd be like, what is the story of the people who own this little cafe or this little bar and grill or, the little white church on the corner and all of those things. And so that was really where the inspiration came from. And so Minden became this place, this like idyllic Midwest small town in Indiana. And I, of course, was working in like the corporate world. It was manufacturing, but it was a Fortune 300 company. And I was interacting a lot with the corporate office, traveling all the time, jet setting. I actually managed the entire like college recruiting process for this company. And so it was universities, I was interviewing students, doing trainings and all of those things and managing intern program. And so the idea for the book was what happens if this high-powered business executive type of woman ends up in this small town for some reason. And in Falling on Main Street, the reason ended up being that her career fell apart. And through no fault of her own, but her reputation was in shambles and she just really needed to escape from that world for a while. And so she leaves St. Louis, which is where she lived, and she basically drives, until she runs out of gas in Minden, Indiana. And it's the story of how God pulled her to the town and pulled her to himself and the people that she meets kind of along the way.
Were you always planning to make it into a series, or did subsequent books kind of surprise you? Did the inspiration just kind of pop in out of nowhere and suddenly you knew you had to write those books as well?
The inspiration for, book 2 came while I was writing this one. So because I never intended for this book to see the world, I didn't plan on writing a series, but once I realized that, I really like this gal who's the waitress at the small town cafe. I think she needs a story, and who's it going to be with? And so that became book 2. And then same, as I met the characters within Minden, I wanted to write their stories as well. So that's how it came about, and it ended up turning into this series of like. This book 1 takes place in fall, book 2 takes place in winter, spring, and then summer.
Which book in the Main Street Minden series was the easiest to write or possibly most rewarding? And which book would you say was the most difficult for you to write?
Hardest book for me to write was probably my last book. It's called Summer to Remember, and it's the one I mentioned with a mixed race couple. She's a mixed race character, so it was challenging for me because obviously I am not a person of color, and so I had to be very intentional about writing her character. I got a lot of wonderful feedback from people in my life who could speak to those truths and that experience. But I had to write some really hard scenes in that book, where this girl, her name's Danielle and Mark go to like the 4th of July picnic in the small town at a friend's house, and some ignorant jerk comes up and starts talking about how she doesn't belong there and how they don't belong together because he views her skin color as something insurmountable. And it was hard to write because I don't think that way. It almost makes you feel like dirty to write it because you're like, I'm in this character's head, and I don't want to be. It's a dark place. I don't want to be in there. So that was hard to write, but it ended up being, it's one of my favorite books for sure. It also deals with like the Me Too movement and the believing the stories of women, but also the danger of false allegations, because obviously Mark is a wonderful man and would never do that to a student. So it was a really fun book to write, but it was a hard book to write because it dealt with some really hard, real topics. And I would say that's the same for my Spring Fever book, because it tells the story of a daycare owner. She runs an in-home daycare, but she's desperate for a family and a husband, and she loves children. But she has a history, and it was actually based off of the story of one of my friends from college who got pregnant in college and with a guy who was no good for her, and ended up finding out that the baby had a chromosome disorder and would probably not survive. Probably wouldn't make it to term, but definitely wouldn't survive afterwards. And her decision to choose life, even though it was going to be hard. She was looking at potentially being a single mother of a genetically challenged baby, and so it was a hard book to write too, but it was also really satisfying to challenge that topic and to speak truth in, what does God say about sanctity of life, but also what does he say about caring for people who've made a different choice. And so it was, it's fun. It's a good book to read too. I make these sound really heavy, but they're not. They're love stories with happily ever afters and, really funny scenes. And it's real life, and it's romance, and it's God working in the lives of these characters, and in me as I write them. So I hope that answered the question.
Which of the characters in the Main Street Minden series do you relate to the most, and why?
I would have to say that I probably relate most with Charlotte from Falling on Main Street. She's the person who makes the shift from corporate executive to small town refuge, I guess. And I feel like she really struggled with, okay, how do I either live in this world and accomplish things and use the gifts that God gave me, but also how do I follow him when this is what I was going for? I was aiming for this successful career, and how can I do that in this place? How do I do that when I'm not in the city? How do I do that when I'm not a part of this company? And it was my first book, right? I think you always write yourself into your first book. So she was me, and her journey is a little different. She isn't actually a Christian when she finds herself in Minden. And so not only is she learning about who she is and what her purpose is, but also she's learning about who God is, and whether she can be happy and whether she can overcome the things in her past. So that's probably who I relate to the most. She's, at least on her journey wise, personality wise, we are very different people. But coming from the corporate world and the full-time job and making the shift to now we live in this little tiny town in Missouri, and I am not using my degree, and I'm not accomplishing the things that I used to accomplish. I'm not the person in the business clothes with the rolly suitcase hitting my next flight. I'm the one pulling toddlers and, going to the grocery store and sitting on my computer writing books. So I think that having that kind of fish out of water storyline in my first book helped a lot, because I think as I was writing her journey and editing this book, it was the journey that I was going on with kind of letting go of some of those ambitions, or at least repurposing them, because I still have goals and ambitions. They're just different than they were. And I think that's a lot of what Charlotte goes through in this book. This has been so good. I'm so glad that you're doing this series of interviews. I think that there's so much opportunity out there for readers to discover Christian authors that they don't know. And I think part of that is because as Christian readers, we put a lot of faith and trust into the publishers to make sure that the material is, biblically sound, and, that we're not going to find ourselves reading something that we didn't want to. And it's a lot scarier when you go and you start looking at authors you don't know and trying to judge a book by its description or its cover or its reviews, to say, okay, is this a biblical book? Am I going to find myself in the middle of a bedroom scene or what? And so I think a lot of what needs to be built between authors and readers is trust. And without the publishing house playing kind of middleman and saying, oh yes, you can trust this author, these videos are a great way to kind of build that trust directly. So Jenna, thank you for doing this and for hosting it. I am a big fan of yours, and I have had a lot of fun. So I hope I didn't leave too much editing for you to do. I tried to do my best. Have a wonderful
Thank
day.
you so much to Tara for participating in my author interview series. It means so much to have so many authors who are willing to participate and who are willing to share their stories and their processes and what works for them, and hopefully encourage a lot of new or aspiring writers, as well as get the attention of a lot of excited readers. I know that I love getting behind the scenes information, and I also really love learning, and I'm super excited that this series benefits both of those goals. Don't forget to check out all of Tara's information, which will be linked in the description box below, as well as a wealth of other information about both myself, my book club, this series, and a lot of what I do, which is, of course, reading, writing, and reviewing Christian and biblical fiction. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Jenna Van Mourik. I post regular, more normal reading videos and bookish videos here every single week. In addition to these weekly author interviews, I'm also active on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all the social media, you name it, I'm there pretty much daily, so make sure that you go ahead and follow me on all of those platforms if you want to keep up with me, my writing, what I'm reading, and what I'm doing with my life on a daily basis. Thank you guys again so much for watching. My name is Jenna Van Mourik, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!